Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth episode in our webinar series, Climate Change, How Nature-Based Solutions Restore Balance. My name is Jordy Kersey, and I'm a PhD student in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems under the supervision of Sean Stickler. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the UBC's Vancouver campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Each of you are joining us today from many places near and far, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of those lands. I would encourage everyone to take a moment and situate yourselves in a place. On whose territories do you currently reside? How are you accountable to the people of those lands? If you don't know whose territories you're on, we'd encourage you to begin that learning journey by doing some research to find out. One way you can do this is by going to nativeland.ca. Thank you for joining us today for the fourth installment of Farm to Globe, Transforming Our Food Systems, a webinar series focusing on what has become readily apparent not only to our food systems experts, but to the general public, that our food systems need fixing. We'll be exploring the most pressing issues our food systems face today and hoping to find innovative solutions to these challenges. We'll also be focusing on the social and racial inequalities that are present in and exacerbated by all of these issues. Join us for discussions that we hope will drive action and discover what steps we need to take to transform our food systems from farm to globe. This series is presented by the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at the UBC Farm, generously sponsored by RBC Royal Bank and in partnership with the UBC Faculty of Land and Food Systems and the BC Food Web. The Center for Sustainable Food Systems at UBC Farm is a teaching and research center, as well as a local to global food hub working towards a more sustainable food secure future. Our mission is to innovate from field to fork to achieve resilient, thriving, and socially just food systems for all. The BC Food Web is a web portal project which aims to increase access and connection to current research and other resource materials. In addition, it aims to encourage innovation between farmers and researchers for future project collaborations. The Faculty of Land and Food Systems is a world leader in research and in teaching about a sustainable and healthy food supply. Today's webinar topic is Climate Change, How Nature-Based Solutions Restore Balance. We are very fortunate to have Drew Bondar, Terry Sunderland, and Larry Mcdermott speak about what nature-based solutions to climate change are, what we are doing locally and globally to implement them, and their own perspectives on how to move forward. After each panelist gives a brief presentation, we will then move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have questions for the panelists, please navigate to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control panel and share them with us. Also, feel free to upvote others' questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. If you would like the opportunity to chat with other attendees, the chat feature will be available. However, inappropriate and offensive comments will not be tolerated, and you will be immediately removed from the webinar. Lastly, we ask you to bear with us if there are any unexpected technological difficulties or distractions. First up, we have Drew Bondar. Drew is passionate about food systems, from the biodiversity in soil to the networks we use to distribute food. As the executive director for an NGO that works with farmers to enhance farmland for soil health and wildlife habitat, and the founder of a small business that rescues and delivers off-grade produce, Drew has experience working across the food supply chain. With dual degrees in agroecology and civil engineering, Drew's educational background has provided training in a wide range of disciplines, from project management to soil biology. Society is facing unprecedented challenges when it comes to climate change and biodiversity loss. Drew is committed to finding solutions to these challenges at the local level that are socially, environmentally, economically sustainable.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jordan, for that introduction. As Jordan mentioned, my name is Drew Bondar, and I am the Executive Director of the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust, which is a nonprofit organization that works with farmers in the Fraser River estuary of British Columbia to improve soil health and enhance farmland for wildlife habitat. Sorry. For my presentation today, I'm just going to start off by talking briefly about the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust in terms of why we were established, the work we do, and then I will look at some agriculture nature-based solutions, specifically 3 of our stewardship programs that support these nature-based solutions, including winter cover crops, grassland set asides, and hedgerows. And then from there, I will look at some of the co-benefits of nature-based solutions, specifically supporting and increasing biodiversity, which is a core objective of our organization. And then I will wrap everything up with lessons that we've learned through working with local farmers and the local agricultural sector for the last 30 years now on farmland stewardship. So the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust was established back in 1993 by a group of farmers and conservationists who at the time were quite concerned with the ongoing loss of farmland that was occurring, as well as concerned with just ensuring that farmland was being managed in such a way to support the large populations of migratory birds that pass through the region every winter. The Fraser River estuary supports the greatest abundance and diversity of migratory birds in all of Canada. And as the landscape has changed significantly since the estuary was diked and drained for agriculture in the late 1800s, many species of birds that inhabit the region have become dependent on farmland for roosting and foraging habitat as a result. And this is particularly challenging for farmers today whose fields sustain extensive damage over the winter season due to waterfowl grazing, which again is one of the main core reasons the organization was established. Our motto is partners in stewardship, as we are 100% dependent on local farmers to voluntarily participate and implement our stewardship programs. We coordinate 7 different stewardship programs, all of which integrate research, education, and financial incentives to, again, either improve soil health and or provide wildlife habitat on farmland. Our stewardship programs are structured on a cost share where we share in the cost with farmers to financially incentivize these best management practices. In addition to our stewardship programs, we do also conduct a lot of research, both internally and in partnership with various academic institutions, including the University of British Columbia, where we've worked in close partnership for many, many years, practically since the organization was established. And besides our stewardship programs and research, we do also conduct a lot of outreach, including field tours, presentations, as well as hosting an annual agriculture awareness event called Day at the Farm in partnership with Western Mine Herb Farm that sees typically 4,000 to 5,000 people come out from across Metro Vancouver to learn all about local agriculture, as well as the additional benefits that agricultural land provides besides food production. Last year, we dispersed roughly $500,000 to just over 40 farmers and landowners through our stewardship programs. And since the organization was established, we've dispersed roughly $9.6 million in cooperative cost share payments, which has resulted in the enhancement of over 3,500 acres of farmland on an annual basis. So agriculture and nature-based solutions. Before diving right into those, I just wanted to quickly kind of define what a nature-based solution is. And nature-based solutions are just simply actions that either protect or manage natural and semi-natural ecosystems to address some of the societal challenges we are facing currently, such as climate change and biodiversity loss. And these nature-based solutions tend to provide benefits for both the environment as well as human well-being. There are many different nature-based solutions for agriculture. Some of them include nutrient and manure management, reduced tillage, incorporating legumes, and that's just to name a few. For today, I'm going to be focusing more on 3 solutions that the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust supports, including planting cover crops, grassland set asides, and hedgerows. Before getting into each of those programs, I just want to touch on how exactly these practices can mitigate climate change. And without getting too much into the details, broadly, they either trap carbon in the soil and in above ground biomass, so in the case of hedgerows and the vegetation itself, or they reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the soil. So winter cover crops is one of our core stewardship programs, and a cover crop is a crop that's planted after the harvest of the annual cash crop in late summer, which typically occurs in September for us. And over the late summer months, early fall months, with the remaining warm weather and hopefully a little bit of precipitation, these fields germinate and then establish into these dense vegetative covers as seen in that picture there. And cover crops provide a wide range of benefits, both for soil as well as biodiversity. Some of the soil benefits include, particularly with regards to mitigating climate change, winter cover crops can increase soil organic matter over time, so trapping some of that carbon in the soil. They can also reduce soil erosion from heavy winter rains, which is characteristic of the region. If it's a legume cover crop, it can fix nitrogen, scavenge the soil for leftover nutrients, so it reduces nutrient leaching. reduce soil compaction, improve water infiltration, suppress weeds. The list is really almost endless. So many benefits to planting a winter cover crop when it comes to soil, but equally as important is the benefits that cover crops can provide for biodiversity through providing habitat for wildlife. As I mentioned earlier, the Fraser River estuary supports large populations of migratory birds every winter, and the estuary has also been significantly altered from its natural state. And as a result of that, many birds have become dependent on farmland, and particularly migratory waterfowl, which will extensively forage on these winter cover crop fields over the winter season, as well as rest on these fields during storm events or during periods of high tide. So we have about 3,000 acres enrolled in the program annually. And since the program was established, we've had roughly 85,000 acres of cover crops planted. We offer a $50 to $65 cost share just to financially incentivize this practice. Grassland Set Asides is another one of our core stewardship programs, and a set aside is simply just farmland that is temporarily removed from production, seeded to a mixture of grass and legume species, and then left to rest for anywhere from 1 to 6 years. And set asides, much like winter cover crops, provide a range of benefits, both for the soil as well as biodiversity. Set asides over time can increase soil organic matter, so trapping some of that carbon in the soil, which can contribute to mitigating climate change. Set asides also reduce soil erosion, can improve soil structure, reduce soil compaction, as well as improve nutrient cycling, as well as yields for select crops. Besides the soil benefits, set asides also provide habitat for wildlife, so it supports biodiversity. These set aside fields resemble the historical tall grass vegetation that used to exist throughout the estuary prior to it being diked and drained. And these habitats support dense populations of Townsend vole, which is a small mammal common in the area, and the primary food source for a lot of birds of prey, including species at risk such as short-eared owl, barn owl, and Pacific great blue heron. These fields can also provide habitat for beneficial insects as well, including pollinators and predatory insects. We have about 450 to 600 acres that are enrolled on an annual basis. And since the program was established back in 1996, we've supported the planting and maintenance of just about 13,600 acres. To promote this practice, we offer a cost share of $400 an acre, which is quite a bit higher than what we pay for the winter cover crop program. And the reason for that is these fields are actually being removed from production. So it's quite a significant financial investment for a producer to make. Hedgerows is the last best management practice and stewardship program I'm going to touch on. And a hedgerow is just simply linear rows of trees and shrubs planted along farm field margins. Hedgerows, much like cover crops and grassland set asides, provide a wide range of benefits, again, both to soil as well as biodiversity. Hedgerows can act as wind barriers, reducing soil erosion. Again, they sequester carbon both in the soil as well as in the above ground biomass. From a wildlife perspective, hedgerows provide year-round habitat for a diversity of songbirds and birds of prey. In fact, they're some of the only kind of year-round permanent habitat for wildlife in agricultural landscapes. Over half the bird species found on a typical piece of farmland can be attributed to hedgerows, even though these hedgerows comprise such a small portion of the habitat. And again, much like set asides, hedgerows can support beneficial insects, including pollinators and predatory insects, which can improve crop pollination as well as biological pest control. We plant one hedgerow annually, and to date, we've planted just about 10 kilometers of hedgerows. And with this program, we cover the full cost of establishment. So plant material, installation of that plant material, installing drip irrigation, mulch, and then the first 5 years of maintenance to assist with establishment. So some of you might be wondering kind of how much carbon do these hedgerows, cover crops, and set asides actually sequester in the soil? And this is a really big question that many people are asking these days, including Jordan Kersey, who is moderating this webinar and is a PhD candidate at UBC. She is currently investigating changes in soil organic carbon as a result of these 3 best management practices. For her study, she selected sites from across Delta BC based off the historical use of hedgerows, cover crops, and set asides from 1992 to 2016, and compared these to fields without any of these best management practices. Study results have found that soil organic carbon at sites with hedgerows was 66% and 26% greater at depths of 0 to 15 and 15 to 30 centimeters, compared to sites with no hedgerows. The cover crops were the soil organic carbon was 33% and 45% greater at soil depth 0 to 15 and 15 to 30 centimeters. And for cover crops and grassland set asides combined, soil organic carbon was 60% and 71% greater at depths 0 to 15 and 15 to 30 centimeters. And that's compared again to no cover crops or grassland set asides. So these results are very encouraging and certainly highlight the significant beneficial impact that hedgerows, cover crops, and grassland set asides can have on potentially increasing soil organic matter, or at least maintaining and subsequently contributing to mitigating climate change over time. So besides nature-based solutions providing significant benefits to improving soil health as well as mitigating climate change, these solutions also offer a range of additional co-benefits, including supporting and increasing biodiversity, which again is a core objective of our organization. Besides a lot of the soil research we've done over the years, we have also conducted many wildlife surveys, primarily focused on birds, again, as this region is so important for migratory birds. And what we've found through these surveys is that cover crops, hedgerows, and grassland set asides tend to support higher bird abundance and diversity compared to annual crop fields. So just for my next couple of slides, I'm going to touch on some of those survey results. We've been conducting waterfowl surveys on agricultural land for the last 5 years now, with the objective of evaluating the types of birds that we're seeing, waterfowl that we are seeing utilizing agricultural land and their preference for certain crop types and field types. We completed a multi-year analysis this past winter for the years from 2017 to 2021, and we found the winter cover crop supported the highest density of waterfowl compared to all other field types included in that survey. We've also been conducting bird surveys of our grassland set aside fields, specifically focused on species at risk, including the Pacific great blue heron, short-eared owl, barn owl, as well as diurnal raptors. And what we found in our survey this past winter was that raptors and herons utilize grassland set asides significantly more than annual crop fields, which again is just illustrated in that figure to the right. In fact, 16 times as much in terms of the total time spent in each of these habitats. And also that species diversity was significantly higher in grassland set asides compared to annual crop fields. Lastly, we have also been conducting songbird surveys of our hedgerows in partnership with the BCIT Ecological Restoration Program for a number of years, looking at abundance and species diversity. And as you'll see in that figure to the right, there's an increasing trend both in abundance and diversity of birds and hedgerows as they age, and especially compared to annual crop fields, which we have the 50 and 100 meter control sites, which are annual crop fields. And then we have DF and WT planted hedgerows in the middle, which are medium aged, anywhere from 5 to 25 years. And then our reference sites, which were hedgerows that are 40 plus years old. In those surveys, we also identified over 70 species of birds utilizing these hedgerows. So just to wrap everything up, Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust has been working in close partnership with roughly 40 farmers and landowners for just about 30 years now. And the success of our organization and stewardship programs truly has been a result of developing programs that actually work for local producers and that share in the cost to implement. Cover crops and grassland set asides are feasible nature-based solutions that are both easily scalable and effective at addressing current issues such as climate change and biodiversity loss. But again, that's absolutely dependent on kind of sharing in the cost with growers to implement these practices, especially in a region such as ours where it's so expensive to farm. Hedgerows are much more challenging. Again, you're permanently removing farmland for production, and with how high land prices are in this region, it's very challenging for farmers to do this without greater financial support. What that support could look like potentially could be a payment for the ecological goods and services that these habitats provide, but that is unfortunately yet to be seen here. So just to conclude, soil conservation and its impact on mitigating climate change and wildlife habitat conservation and its impact on increasing biodiversity can be achieved simultaneously if we ensure the agricultural viability of local farms. So without local farms' ability to remain profitable, these sorts of concerns about providing habitat for wildlife on farmland, as well as implementing nature-based solutions, are going to be more of an afterthought to farmers, as there really only appears to be an endlessly growing list of challenges that farmers are facing. Just want to quickly acknowledge our sponsors and funders that make our work possible, including Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Delta Agricultural Society, Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, Wildlife Habitat Canada, BC Waterfowl Society, the City of Delta and City of Richmond, as well as Ducks Unlimited Canada. All of these funders have been long-term supporters, and yes, we wouldn't be able to do our stewardship programs without their help. So other than that, questions, which I think we will be waiting till the other two speakers have presented. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Drew. Next up, we have Terry Sunderland. Terry is currently a professor at the Faculty of Forestry, University of British Columbia, Canada, focusing on the biological and human dimensions of the sustainable management and utilization of tropical forests. He was previously a senior principal scientist at the Center for International Forestry Research, C4, Indonesia, where he coordinated C4's work on forest and food security, biodiversity conservation, and integrated landscape management. Prior to joining C4 in early 2006, Terry was based in West Africa for over 15 years and worked on numerous conservation and livelihood-focused projects. Having both a field practitioner and academic background gives him a wide perspective on conservation, livelihoods, and related issues. Terry has a master's degree in forestry from the University of Oxford and a PhD from the University of London. He has published more than 240 research papers, book chapters, and books. Terry is an active blogger and engages regularly with the media on disseminating research for policy influence and outreach.
Thank you very much, Jordan. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to come at this issue of nature-based solutions from a slightly different angle. As mentioned, I've only been at UBC 3 years or so. I've spent the last 30 years working in the tropics primarily. So I'm going to talk about agricultural food systems and the nexus of tropical forestry in the context of climate change and potential solutions, and sort of bring that home a little bit towards the end of the presentation. And there we go. So the current global food system has been described in many different ways. One of the ways in which it has been described is it's somewhat broken. Even though we're producing more food than ever before in human history, we waste a lot of food. There are vast inequities in the food system in terms of distribution, food sovereignty issues. I'll touch on that a little bit later. And we've seen this massive dietary shift from diverse diets relying on many, many different species of animals and plants to a much more simplified diet, which is focused on commodity crops, high in fats and oils, and refined carbohydrates, so basically calories. And these dietary transitions have been driven by urbanization, purchasing power, the role of agribusiness, which is often contentious, and it's resulted in these sort of big simplified food systems. A great example of this is a change in portions. You see the difference between the wartime portions of chicken and potatoes compared to today. And this has been a pervasive issue. We need to grow more food to basically throw it away. So on the right-hand side of this diagram, even though we're producing all this food, it's having terrible impacts on nutrition and health. We have a sort of daily feast or famine. 2 billion people suffer from a deficiency of micronutrients. 2 billion of people get too many. We've got 820 million rather, still suffer from hunger. And we have obviously also concomitant environmental impacts of our food system. One of those in particular, this is a slide that came from the UN Food Systems Pre-Summit, which was held this week, which we participated in. And we're looking at the impacts of current agriculture on the environment and on nature. And the two big issues here that I'm going to focus on is the issue of global deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions supplied by agricultural expansion. So what I want to distinguish here is the difference between permanent forest loss and temporary forest loss. So agricultural expansion is responsible for an annual 40% loss of permanent forest loss. So that means the forest is cut down, a commodity is planted, whether it's oil palm, soy, it could be a cattle pasture, and that forest will never recover, that forest will never come back. We know that in terms of shifting cultivation, we're talking about more temporary deforestation. Again, I'll touch on that in the next slide. But the other issue that we want to touch on here is that agriculture in its form, which includes deforestation, accounts for approximately 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is not insignificant. So the current model of agriculture and our food system not only contributes towards greenhouse gas emissions, environmental destruction, but also not really optimistic or beneficial health outcomes as well. So smallholder producers are much underestimated in terms of their contributions to the global food system. And the estimates of the amount of global food that's produced in smallholder, less than 2 hectare systems range between 30 to 80%. Whichever way you look at it, it's still a considerable amount of the food that's produced in the world. Many of these smallholder systems produce a diversity of produce and a diversity of products. These systems are more resilient against economic and environmental shocks, but there's really little or no government support to many smallholders. And in fact, in some countries they're even demonized. The actual system of swidden agriculture or shifting agriculture is often demonized as being responsible for deforestation. And the point about these systems, which are essentially managing forests for food, is that they provide temporal deforestation, which allows forests to grow back. And that's a huge and significant difference to the permanent conversion for commodity crops. And many smallholders actually are responsible for the conservation of agrobiodiversity. So relic crops that we would need to go back to introduce new traits, new genes, as we're breeding commodity crops that need basically pest disease resistance, or in the case of rice, the famous case of rice, scuba rice, the rice that's able to grow completely underwater. And this is extremely important. A lot of agriculture in the tropics is shifting towards what's referred to as climate smart or conservation agriculture, which essentially means minimal soil disturbance, ensuring permanent soil cover, and rotating crops and intercropping. And intercropping often with trees and other woody crops. So I want to touch a little about the contribution of forests and trees to food security, which is something I work on fairly extensively. And we know that forests and trees have a direct contribution, the provision of harvest, of bushmeat rather, wild meat, wild fruits, and incidentally, over half of the world's fruits are grown on trees, and other forest source foods, which are actually rich in micronutrients, so extremely important in terms of nutrition and dietary diversity, but a relatively small proportion of the overall diet. And forests also provide the habitat for shifting cultivation. So in terms of indirect contributions, forest ecosystem services, we know now that there's strong evidence to show that wheat in Ethiopia, for example, that's grown in the proximity of forests, has a higher yield and higher nutritional content because of the soil nutrient interactions that go on with those trees. And also forests are used in other ways. People harvest timber, they harvest medicinal plants and other non-timber forest products. And these are often sold, which allow people to purchase food items. So there's a strong connection there economically between forests and agriculture in the tropics. Fodder for livestock is extremely important, and also wood for energy and cooking. And again, often demonized, the fuel wood is a major protagonist of greenhouse gas emissions. But for many billions of people, in fact, I think the estimate is 1.9 or 2 billion people rely on fuel wood, particularly for sterilizing water, so making water potable, and also for cooking. So just to show that in a rather horrible spaghetti-like diagram, here we go, the direct provisioning services and indirect, and contributing to the 4 pillars of food security: availability, access, utilization, and stability. I want to talk about some of the evidence that's been generated about the links between forests and food security and a more sustainable food system. So in 2015, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations commissioned a report which basically showed that the forests and trees and the landscapes in which they're situated are an integral part of the solution to the global problem of food security and nutrition. This led to a subsequent consultation, which is a much more political one, commissioned by the Committee on World Food Security, which is associated with the UN, and showed again that forests and trees, again, play a very important role as a contribution towards food security and nutrition in numerous ways and at different levels. And this has actually proved to be the greatest opportunity to get the food security community to think about the integration of forest trees when they're talking about food security. At the moment, the food security agenda is very focused on the increase of food, which correlates to the increase of population. As I mentioned, we actually grow enough food to supply our current and growing populations, but it's a very linear thinking that is driving this pervasive transformation of habitats into agriculture for the attainment of calories, if you like. So the Sustainable Development Goals actually present quite a nice opportunity to think about the integration of food systems beyond just calories and agriculture, and particularly climate action, thinking about the contribution of agriculture, negative contribution of agriculture to climate change, and also thinking about biodiversity. So SDG 15, life on land. Again, I'll come back to the SDGs in a second. But it is possible to actually increase your food security and attain food security without clearing forests, and a number of countries have done so through various different strategies, through restoration using food plants. South Korea has been a fantastic example of that. Their restoration program from the 50s onwards focused very much on the provision of utilitarian trees, and their country went from, I think, being 15% to now 95% forested. So a really good example of achieving food security, but not at the expense of trees and forests. The other issue that's happening in the tropics is a very strong movement towards conserving yet more areas. So the solution to climate change, of course, is to conserve forests so they act as carbon sinks, so we can basically pollute as much as we want, but as long as forests are conserved, that's great. Well, that has a huge impact on those people who rely on those resources, and current movements to set aside 50% or 30% of the earth, as many countries have recently committed to, have a huge impact on access rights, etc., when you're annexing land for protected areas. And this is becoming a very contentious issue with the conservation community in particular. The other movement that has sort of gained resonance is the global commitments towards forest landscape restoration. The Bond Challenge, the Africa 100 commitments, whereby planting trees is seen as the solution to mitigate climate change. And in many instances, that's the case. There was this famous incident a year or so ago where Ethiopia planted millions of seedlings, but very little information on what trees, where they were planted, were people displaced, was farmland affected, what are the long-term monitoring and evaluation impacts of this. Tree planting is not necessarily the solution. And guidelines are starting to be developed on thinking about more about the intricacies of planting trees, why, where, how, and who by, and for what reason. And we should think about restoration, not about tree planting, but actually tree growing. Just thinking about ecosystem restoration in a much more longer term and holistic way. And again, this has become quite a contentious issue with all the commitments, global commitments that are happening. Another really good example of mitigating the impacts of climate change, I'm sure everybody on this webinar is aware of the impact of oil palm on biodiversity and deforestation in Southeast Asia in particular. Norway was able to reduce their consumption of oil palm or palm oil by about 60 to 80% after a ban on government purchasing, but also a very, very clever consumer awareness program, which allowed people to understand how much oil palm was in so many different products, which allowed people to make an informed decision about whether or not to buy those products. And it had a huge impact. This is a very good example of the power of the consumer to actually influence what's going on elsewhere in the value chains of Indonesia and Malaysia, for example. One big problem also, as I mentioned, we're relying on the large blocks of tropical forests to maintain their position as carbon sinks. And in many instances they are. But recent research that's come out of Central Africa and the Amazon shows that the long-term impacts of climate change, which basically droughts, reduction in rainfall, is leading to higher mortality in many of these forest blocks, which is leading to a tipping point whereby these tropical forests move from carbon sinks to carbon sources. And this is also going to be equally problematic. So we can't rely on the tropical forest to soak up excess carbon dioxide that we're also happy to spout out. One of the big problems, certainly in many of the landscapes that I work in, is essentially these landscapes are administered by different government agencies. So there's very much a siloed mentality towards their management. And that's reflected also in the way that they're managed in terms of the different targets. Which part of the landscape is managed for, I don't know, agriculture or forestry or for waterways. And this is an example whereby we've sort of integrated the sustainable development goals in a much more integrated manner, in a sort of obviously hypothetical landscape. And we need to think about landscapes much more in this way, as integrated systems where everything is connected. And the real beauty of the SDGs actually is essentially that we can show a connectivity between food production and poverty, food production and life on land, and zero hunger, etc. And so this interconnectivity is yet really to be harnessed. But it does provide a really good framework to think about how all these things are connected. And this is basically a graphic that shows how we should be thinking and why we should be thinking in that way, and have much more integrated approaches to land management. Think about landscapes rather than systems, and rather than agricultural systems or forestry systems. So a much more holistic, integrated, overarching approach to land management is much more effective for mitigating climate change and also in terms of adaptation to climate change. One thing I did want to touch on also is that unfortunately many of the processes that influence what happens with our land in the world happens at what's referred to, and I hate this expression, a high level, that basically the realities on the ground are not reflected by policies implemented by those responsible for setting those policies. And we see that very much with the UNFCCC, the United Nations climate change committees, and the meetings, and I've been to numerous kind of sessions related to the UNFCCC, and it is very much dominated by high-level discussions, and the grassroots, the bottom-up processes are actually almost exclusively missed. The other issue that we sort of come across a lot is, here at BC, we're now experiencing a fairly unprecedented heat wave. But we haven't been very good about either predicting it. Of course, these things are hard to predict, but mitigating climate change before it actually happens. So we always deal with the impacts when they occur. And as a society, we tend to be sort of reactive rather than proactive. A really good example that is the incidence of zoonotic diseases, and not just Ebola and probably COVID-19, but when deforestation occurs, we see massive increases in dengue and malaria. But this doesn't stop deforestation. We deal with the end product. We deal with the fact that people get sick, and that is exponentially more expensive than avoiding deforestation. A fantastic example of that is it's estimated that we've spent $64 trillion on mitigating, on dealing with COVID-19, when actually an estimate of $300 billion in avoided deforestation would have been sufficient to stop this spillover of this zoonotic disease in the first place. So there are interesting trade-offs to think about in terms of mitigation and avoidance. One thing that I've become increasingly frustrated by is thinking about sustainable development. And I went to a meeting in London in July 2015, so 6 years ago, where Mark Burrows stood up on stage. He's from Credit Suisse, and announced there was going to be all this money available for sustainable landscapes and climate change. 6 years on, I don't see the money, and the financial institutions haven't really stepped up to the plate in terms of making available these funds. And it's very difficult to think about where they're coming from. And ironically, in Glasgow with the next UNFCCC meeting, he's going to be speaking again on progress. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing what the progress has been in releasing these sort of multi-trillion-dollar investments for climate change and sustainable landscapes. I just saw these this morning. I just posted them because we are living in very difficult and trying times. Again, we now have to react to this because we haven't been proactive enough. And also, it also highlights the disparity between the global north and the global south about how much we in Canada, the US, Europe, elsewhere are responsible for far more carbon emissions than most individuals in the tropics. Yet we put the onus very much on tropical countries to avoid deforestation, to protect their ecosystems, etc. And just finally, these, because it's not only an environmental issue, it's also become a political issue, and so it should. And so at that point, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Terry. Finally, we have Larry Mcdermott. Larry is an Algonquin from Shoba Abidjan First Nation and is the Executive Director of Plenty Canada. Larry is currently a member of numerous organizations, including the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity, the Canadian Environmental Network, UNESCO, and the Ontario Recovery Strategy for the American Eel. A former three-time mayor and longtime council member of Lanark Highlands, was the first chair of the Rural Forum of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, was a commissioner for the Ontario
supplies, envelopes, that kind of stuff. We pretty much know what's here and what's not here.
We ready to go?
Yeah, I just have a little bit more introduction for you.
Oh, okay, sorry. I saw you
worries.
pause and my volume's low. I'm gonna try to change that.
Okay. So Larry was also a commissioner for the Ontario Human Rights Commission and was on the Ontario Species at Risk Public Advisory Committee. Larry also served as a comprehensive claim representative for Shabat Abidjan First Nation, is a certified tree marker and butternut assessor, and holds other environmental certifications. He has also received an honorary doctorate of law from the University of Guelph. Larry was a humble student for many years of the late Algonquin elder grandfather William Commanda, who created the Circle of All Nations organization. Larry lives in a 170-year-old log home on 500 acres of biologically diverse Algonquin land along the Mississippi River with his wife, Nancy.
Okay. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I don't know why my volume is so low. I apologize, but I will just, we'll go ahead. Well, certainly for us, the issues of forestry, agriculture, indigenous ways of providing food are very important. And also there's really intersections with conservation and but you know, it may sound like you've heard it before and it maybe even heard it too often, but truly everything is connected. And we take a holistic approach to feeding ourselves. My personal experience is I actually have an undergraduate work in agricultural science. I found it very interesting to hear the other speakers and to reflect on our priorities. I'm going to add something right up front. Is that I hear the conventions. I was in Rio in 1992. I was in Nagoya in 2010. I often hear 2 of 3 of the conventions that came out of the Earth Summit. The third one is desertification, and people think of sand dunes, but it's actually topsoil. And globally, we've lost 25% of our topsoil since 1970. So I just wanted to share that, whether our perspective is conventional agriculture or it's indigenous ways of knowing and living. I also, I'm thinking a little bit about the Pathways 1 process that addressed those conventions and looked at indigenous protected and conserved areas, but there was a co-governance model. We actually drew upon our historical origins. In other words, in the Constitution Act of 1982, you'll find the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the subsequent treaty process a year later in 1764. At that time, Indigenous peoples, there were between 2,000 and 2,500 chiefs who came to meet with the British Crown and negotiate sharing the land. And in those negotiations, food was a high priority. In fact, there was a concern about the rate in which the newcomers were harvesting fish and trees, and the impact that it would have on food systems, as well as other ways of living Menopamadism, which is living the good life in Algonquin. And so what was negotiated was a sharing of both Indigenous laws buoyed to natural law. And natural law, elders that have taught me, is the one law that human beings follow. They cannot change it. And that is that you have to protect the life-giving capacity of Mother Earth. And when you don't, eventually you squeeze Mother Earth's capacity. You squeeze the opportunities to find shelter, clothing, and food. And so in 1764, the nations that participated in those negotiations were mindful of the largest treaty ever on Turtle Island or North America, and that's the dish with one spoon. And the dish with one spoon came with three simple laws. One, take only what you need. Two, make sure there's some left for others. So that might mean that you have to temper what you determine to be what you need. And lastly, keep the dish clean. Well, the dish is the womb of Mother Earth, the creative power and the natural elements. So that's the water, that's the air, that's the land. And if you contaminate those sacred elements, then again, you interfere with natural law. You interfere with the capacity to feed, shelter, and clothe ourselves. And the other, I'm also thinking of, again, those three conventions and the Pathways One process, in which oral Indigenous and Western written systems came together. We opened it in pipe ceremony, which I led because it was on Algonquin territory. And we operated an ethical space that is mindful of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also aware of the 94 calls to action and the 10 principles of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, along with the 7 gifts, which include things like love, truth, humility, wisdom, courage or bravery, and more. So that's what guided us in the process. There was the Indigenous Circle of Experts and the National Advisory Panel, which included agriculture, mining, and forestry. And collectively, in Canada's conservation vision, in the first recommendation, you get into that we accept the Indigenous worldview that we are one species among many who share the land, and that to achieve our goals, we need to do that through reconciliation. So when thinking about food systems, I feel that all those principles should guide us in working out a sharing of the land. And one of the things that COVID has shown us is that, well, first of all, our national systems weren't really prepared to engage Indigenous peoples who are concerned about food sovereignty, who are not relying on conventional food supply systems, and also who are concerned about, as I mentioned, that one dish with one spoon treaty, and how much of what we produce ultimately contaminates the water or the air, or for that matter, the soil, and it, in the long term, is not sustainable, and how much of it contributes to climate change. As someone who studied agricultural science, I know the answer to that is the conventional systems a great deal. I'm glad to hear of a shift, a positive shift. That's encouraging. However, it's still my experience that the John A. Macdonald, who wanted to get rid of the Indian problem to access the lands, is something that still exists. It's still, and there's still inadequate consideration for Indigenous food systems and policies. Really, rarely even open the door for what I would call reconciliation around what has happened in the past and what should happen in the future. And so one of the projects that we have at Plenty Canada is the Healing Place. And the Healing Place is located in Eastern Ontario, and it's designed. There are trees that reflect iconic values of both the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg peoples. So Akwesasne and has been working with Algonquins. And also we have Forest Ontario, OPG, South Nation Conservation, all partnered in creating a space, this healing place, where anywhere from school children and school boards are using it. But in the center of it is iconic Indigenous foods as a way of educating people who come to the Healing Place about the relationship of the forest and foods. And so that's part of the design. And what's happening is, so we're in discussions with other groups to look at that on a province-wide basis and also on national basis. So there's some talks going on now. And so the design is meant to be integrated with the climate change objective of 2 billion trees, but also to bring forward lessons of reconciliation, Indigenous food sovereignty, and culture. And so all those values, those goals are integrated. For us in this particular area, I'm going to shift now to just a quick flyover on food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty. We actually have a project, and we're researching how various Indigenous communities have dealt with the COVID and its impacts on food security and sovereignty. So that includes in the far north, and that includes in populated areas in the south as well. At the same time, for years, we've worked on issues like wild rice, or Manoman, or PG Manoman, and the relationship of gathering the rice for our food needs, but at the same time, the importance of that species in sound aquatic ecosystems the fact that it's food for many species, that it's habitat for many species. And so the synergistic relationships that exist from that species. Even in our gardens, we're growing out old varieties. I have varieties that are 10,000 years old that are growing in my garden. And there's quite a story there, but I'm concerned about our time. And I'm wondering if I should just wrap it up. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But there's so much to the story. I thank you all for listening. Miigwech.
Thanks so much, Larry. It is now time for us to move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. I will be asking our panelists some curated questions, as well as any live audience questions that we might receive. Just a reminder to navigate to the Zoom control panel and select Q&A to input your questions, as well as to upvote others' questions. Okay, so the first question we have is from Gavin Esdale, and they ask, are you aware of the existence of the IUCN's Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions? It's a 2020 publication that offers a comprehensive set of guidelines for ensuring that nature-based solutions reach their desired goals while ensuring that they're also socially responsible. And I invite any of the panelists to respond.
Well, I can respond to that. I actually also responded in the Q&A box as well. Yes, the IUCN have made great strides in developing real firm guidelines for nature-based solutions, making sure they're socially responsible, environmentally sound. And there's a considerable showcase that's going to be happening of those principles and approaches in the forthcoming World Conservation Congress in Marseille in early September, where they're going to be further rolled out and elaborated. But yes, very aware. They've done some fantastic work.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add to that question response? We can move on. Okay, so with the understanding that colonial systems of exploitation are at the root of many, if not all, aspects of the climate crisis, how would you suggest that we actively decolonize efforts to protect our ecosystem?
Well, I'm happy to dive in on that one.
Great.
Yeah, if that's a great question. In order to decolonize those systems, it's going to take a shift from the almost unconscious dominance of one system over alternatives. So that means taking time to talk. You know, what showed up in the COVID response with national funding systems is they were very narrow, they're very conventional, and they didn't even reflect, for example, the values of reconciliation, an approach that really was negotiated to share this land, and part of that colonization was that our education system failed us. There was a narrative that was incomplete, and that was certainly part of the residential school journey. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are all symptoms of circumstances that the way we're going to make that shift is to spend time talking, coming up with better ideas, whether that's at the community level, a local level, or it's through national processes like Pathways One. And for me, what was exciting about Pathways One is it was done right. I still pinch myself that government was involved, because you generally, I don't think of innovation happening there, quite frankly, but it did. And I think a lot can be learned from the governance model that drove Pathways One. And I think we have to find new ways of communicating, and we have to build the capacity to speak cross-culturally. That's part of the decolonizing process. What does that mean? Well, I'm not sure I can answer that in a short answer like this, but I think a lot can be learned by just looking at some of the documents. We Rise Together, Canada's Conservation Vision, and the government response, One with Nature. Go to page 14 and 15, take a look at ethical space. We need to create ethical space, that is safe spaces to tell our truths, and to talk very seriously about making a significant paradigm shift in our economic systems, in our social systems, and our justice systems. And all of that will result in much better outcomes when it comes to issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification. They're all connected. So it really means a shift from our comfort zone into having open and clear dialogue that is cross-cultural. Yeah, I'm going to have to leave it at that. There's much more to it, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Terry or Drew, do you have anything to add to that?
Just to reinforce the point that that I made when I spoke about so many top-down processes demonize those who are actually contributing least to climate change and greenhouse gas emission. The onus is always on resource-rich countries, and the commitments made by climate agreements, for example, the Paris Agreement of 2015, very much puts the onus on less developed countries, which, you know, it is a form of neocolonialism in the first instance. So I think that needs to change, and we need to think about a much more bottom-up approach.
We have a person who reached out to the panelists and said, as ranchers and farmers, we are looking for some advice before we try to implement some strategies on our acreage. We are cautious because we want to do it right. We are wanting to protect riparian areas, mitigate predator issues by expanding a wildlife corridor or sorts, as well as implementing some permaculture type projects to help with water and increasing biodiversity. They're looking for some contacts that they could perhaps forward to us. And I'm not sure if they're still on the call. They also provided an email address. But if you'd like to speak to any contacts they may have. They also said that they forgot to mention they have a hard time finding an expert to run the ideas by, and are mostly looking for a confirmation that their plan won't make anything worse.
I can speak to that. One contact that comes to mind is Farmland Advantage, that is currently administered by the Investment Agriculture Foundation, and they provide cost share funding with ranchers. At this point, I believe primarily in the interior, to do things such as fencing along riparian areas. So that would be my first recommendation, which I am happy to email the individual after we get off this webinar.
Great. There's a question, I think, for Drew that said, what are the farmers using to enrich the soil and fight pests? And maybe if you could just expand on that for a minute for those who didn't read your response in the chat.
Yeah, I just mentioned, I mean, a lot of the farmers that we work directly with who participate in our programs, yeah, planting cover crops or removing farmland for production and allowing that field to rest through our set aside program. As well as I know many farmers in the area are also applying compost and manure in the springtime. All of those practices support a healthier soil, which then makes your crops more resilient and more resilient to crop depredation and things of that nature. Hedgerows as well, we're currently doing a study looking at the impact of hedgerows set asides, as well as floral strips on supporting populations of beneficial insects. And we're also working with blueberry farmers where we're planting floral strips to assess the impact that these habitats have on blueberry crop yields. So biological kind of spotted wing Drosophila is a big problem for blueberry growers. And yeah, we're looking at how these floral strips can support natural pests or natural predators, sorry, to biologically control these crop pests.
Thanks. And for Terry, there's a question that if you wouldn't mind elaborating on from Elizabeth Stevenson, who asked, what are your thoughts on permaculture as a potential design system for successfully integrated land relationships?
Again, I answered that in the box. Fantastic system. The really beneficial part of permaculture is that you can produce a large amount of food in a relatively small space, and specifically in urban areas. And Singapore have made great strides in introducing permaculture to the urban environment and producing basically food cities. Yeah, great potential.
Thanks. I'm just going back through the ones that you have all inserted in the chat and sort of allowing space for you to discuss it now in the time so that those who haven't read it yet might be able to absorb it. There's another question, and that is, it's understood that those who contribute the least to the climate crisis are also the ones who experience the negative effects the most. What can we do to center climate justice in this movement locally and globally? I think this aligns with what Terry was talking about just a few minutes ago.
Do you want me to elaborate on that further, or is my answer previously enough?
Yeah, I think that maybe if you could elaborate on like potentially some ways that locally and globally we could work towards having greater climate justice. If you have anything to speak on.
Maybe I can give an example. So I'm involved heavily in a movement called the Global Landscapes Forum, and their mantra is to create a movement that encourages people, well, 1 billion people is the goal, to implement landscape approaches, so integrated approaches to land management, not only in the tropics, but in temperate regions too. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And in many of the landscapes that I work in countries like Indonesia and Zambia and Ghana, many of those landscapes are managed relatively sustainable by people living and working in those landscapes. And the drivers of change are often external. So it's estimated that between 1.5 to 2 billion people live and work in multifunctional landscapes where there's a mosaic of agriculture and forestry and waterways and fisheries and different land uses, and they do that relatively sustainably. Yet it's still coming from a sort of Western perspective. The Global Landscapes Forum says it's not happening. We should, impose it from a higher level. So we haven't harnessed that grassroots understanding of how people manage the land as well as we should have done. And I believe that you can have an element of both. You can have that grassroots upwards learning, but you can have also, you need that policy framework, you need the implementation, you need the finance for it to happen. So there needs to be a meeting of these two processes or movements, and that's just not happening at the moment. So I think that would be a fantastic start.
Thanks. That seems like a wonderful suggestion. Someone just put in the chat that they can't seem to get the Q&A function working, but they're wondering if there's any examples or potential examples of how BC's forest practices support multi-use food and livelihood activities. You don't have any suggestions from the panelists?
I feel like I'm talking a bit too much. I can answer that to a certain degree. I mean, I'm not too familiar with BC's forestry sector, although, you know, by osmosis, I've learned a little bit in the 3 and a bit years that I've been here. It seems to me, and here I am embedded in the Faculty of Forestry, that the primary focus of BC forest management is for timber, and the other uses, ecosystem services, foodstuffs, support for watersheds, etc., have been largely on the back burner, except for when you think about indigenous management systems that have largely been sort of also sidelined, and I feel that there's an opportunity here to integrate those practices into formal and more diverse forest management systems. So at the moment, there is very little multiple use management. Obviously, recreation is one, and timber is the other. But they seem to be the two sectors that the BC forestry sector is focused on. And I think there's a great opportunity to think about issues of foodstuffs, watershed protection, etc., and much more multiple use. And I think I'll leave it there. Oh, actually, no, I have a little anecdote. On that note, when I first arrived here in the Faculty of Forestry in 2018, I was asked by one of my forestry colleagues, "You work on forest and food security? What the heck has forests got to do with food security?" And that's just an indication of probably the thinking that forests here are managed solely for timber and recreation.
Thank you for that insight. I think that this is a question that could be answered by any and all panelists. If you had a direct line of communication to our government leaders, what is one call to action that you would send their way? And if we want, we could just have all three of you give one call of action.
Sure, I can start there. I mean, based off our stewardship programs, I mean, if I were to ask for anything, it would just obviously be more funding for programs of this nature. Our stewardship programs, I believe, are very cost effective at mitigating a lot of these challenges, as well as supporting local farmers and their ability to implement these programs. I mean, if you look at on an annual basis, we're dispersing roughly $400,000 to $500,000 in cost share payments, and we're able to enhance anywhere from 3,500 to 4,500 acres of farmland, which, I mean, if you spread those costs out across the population of Metro Vancouver, is only a couple dollars really. So I know there's lots of dollars for research and things like that, and what I find to be oftentimes reluctance to support programs of this nature. So I would really just encourage, more funding and more long-term funding commitments to supporting programs such as ours, as well as some of the other programs that exist, I know, across the country.
Excellent. Larry, do you have anything to add as a call of action or call to action?
Sorry, I was muted myself. By the way, I'm unable to open my video. It says the host has it locked. Are we talking about the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or are we just talking very generally?
I think we're talking generally, but if you'd like to speak to both, that is perfectly okay.
Yeah. Well, so for me, I look at the 10 principles on of the 94 calls to action, and there are ones that are specific really to food and our relationship to the land, and the United Nations Declaration also has very specific items. But so I would just start with that. The first principle is that the commission believes that the following guiding principles of truth and reconciliation will assist Canadians moving forward. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the framework for reconciliation at all levels and across all sectors of Canadian society. And it gets into, I would say, look at all 10 of those principles. For example, number 4, reconciliation requires constructive action on addressing the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have had destructive impacts on Aboriginal people's education, cultures, and languages, health, child care, administration of communities, and prosperities. And then the 5th one is reconciliation must create a more equitable and inclusive society by closing the gaps in social health and economic outcomes that exists between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. That's part of that, the sitting down and looking at the big picture that doesn't happen often enough. So that's my short answer to that question.
Thanks. And Terry, do you have any call to action?
Very quick one. If you think about the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, etc., the Aichi targets, many countries agree to set environmental or climate change targets. They have no interest or intent on achieving. And I would like to see a little more accountability when targets are being set and negotiations are being made. It would be interesting to see what happens in Glasgow, whether we haven't met any of the Paris Agreement targets 6 years on, and it'd be interesting to see if there's any accountability related to that. So if you're not going to achieve the targets, don't set them.
That's a great point. We have a question from Olga Schwarzkopf, who asks, do you see the deforestation in the Amazonian rainforest for the production of soybean crops as beneficial to the population of Brazil, especially and including indigenous populations of that forest? Anyone is welcome to speak to that.
Okay, I can try. Yeah, I mean, all of these commodities, soybean, oil palm, cattle, they're surrounded by land conflicts for a reason, and that's because people are displaced. And the benefits that are always cited by nation states, whether it's Indonesia for oil palm or Brazil for soy, are absolutely right in saying these crops produce important income for the national economy, but very little of that income benefits people on a local basis. It's no coincidence that 7 of the 10 billionaires in Indonesia are actually oil palm operators. And this is kind of ridiculous in many respects. I have a PhD student working in oil palm plantations. This is not soy, but the context is exactly the same. And she's done a lot of work on looking at the livelihood benefits of oil palm to local people, and they're very negligible in the sites that she's working in. There may be comparators that we're not aware of, and basically, establishment of these commodities, whether it's soy or oil palm, means the loss of land for people. Often employment opportunities that are promised don't manifest. The social structures that are promised, schools, health, education, often do not manifest. And the benefits accrue at a much higher level, hence the sort of elite capture of most of the benefits. So it's not always a black and white situation. I understand where the question's coming from, but it's a much more nuanced approach. Yes, these products generate a lot of income, but not necessarily for those on the ground.
Thanks. All right, I think we have time for one more question. I think this can also be answered by any and all panelists. What place do individuals have in enacting nature-based solutions compared to our governments and institutions, but also how are they intertwined?
A couple that come to my mind, things like No Mow May, which was a campaign that's encouraging people not to mow their lawns in May, even though it's a small thing. It's just something that someone, a homeowner or a municipality, can easily implement, as well as, I mean, from our perspective, planting more native trees and shrubs instead of lawns and things like that would go a long way to supporting native populations of wildlife and things of that sort. So those are two that just come to my mind.
And as I mentioned in my talk, that don't underestimate the power of the consumer. If you feel that something is environmentally destructive, don't buy it. And unless your oil palm is absolutely guaranteed to be certified sustainable, don't buy products that contain oil palm. And of course, we know how obfuscating the oil palm industry has been in hiding the products in various things that we buy. And it's in pretty much everything. That's just one example. Buy local, buy seasonal. The consumer has incredible power to determine change.
Yeah, the consumer power is something that I thought of. But I think the starting point is for us to constantly be looking at our consumption patterns. How are we feeding ourselves? What is our impact on the land? And I find myself making changes all the time. I thought I was committed decades ago, but I'm re-examining what I would call compromises that I think, oh, I don't really have to compromise that way. There's alternatives that I can find. So that ultimately impacts how I consume. And I think it's important that there's ways of communicating some of those revelations. So in my network of friends, which includes people who are taking a look at indigenous food systems, First Nations Technical Institute in Tyendinaga, for example, at Trent University, the Indigenous Environmental Studies and Science program are looking at those issues. And some of the senior people associated with those institutions are good friends, and we challenge each other. And we try to find other forums. And we're talking about that. How can we get this discussion moving more? I think there's a critical need for those kinds of discussions. Yeah, it's one thing for me to push myself. It's another thing to learn from others and make that job a little easier. And of course, with what we're seeing in terms of climate change, we know maybe we need to push each other. Maybe we need to work together. Maybe we need to share information more effectively. So those are thoughts that come to my mind in terms of that question. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. All right, if any of our panelists have any final remarks, I think we'll start wrapping up.
I do. Should
Go
I go
ahead.
ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say that that I'm thinking about the Canada's Pathways 1, Canada's Conservation Vision, in which agriculture, forestry, and mining were represented along with NGOs, Indigenous peoples, and how in the first recommendation, the second bullet was that we collectively accept the Indigenous worldview that we're one species among many who share the land. So the reality is the only solutions are nature-based. There's no solutions that aren't. Otherwise, we're fooling ourselves. And so a lot of what we talked about, and I can remember Chloe Dragon-Smith, the youngest member of the National Advisory Panel, but the youngest member throughout the Pathways 1, she kept saying, we are nature. When somebody would use, would express themselves in such a way that we're separate. And so I think that's important. That needs to be part of the narrative when we talk about nature-based solutions. We really need to understand there aren't any other solutions. We're all connected. We're to all of life, and when we try to operate and entertain notions of separation, we get into trouble.
Thank you for that wonderful point for all of us to leave on. All right, I know that there's probably some unanswered questions, and we thank all of you for sharing your time with us. Keep your eye out for a follow-up email, which will address some of these questions and share resources on what we've learned today. Also, thank you again to our presenters, Drew Bondar, Terry Sunderland, and Larry Mcdermott. Behind the scenes, we would like to thank Melanie Cooksdorf and Mairead Norton and Mackenzie Dorsey. Be sure to join us next week for our episode titled Climate Change, Mobilizing Industry to Make a Difference on August 5th from 11 to 12:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Let us know what you thought about the webinar. You'll be directed to a short survey about this session after the webinar, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. Also, feel free to visit us at ubcfarm.ubc.ca. And thanks again for joining in, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.